Now at 5, this is new video just coming in. Iran launches a rocket attack on U.S. forces in Iraq, escalating the conflict between the two countries. Right now on KPIX5 and streaming on CBSN Bay Area, it is the payback that Iranian leaders warned was coming. Good evening, I'm Alan Martin.
And I'm Veronica Dela Cruz. The Pentagon confirming more than a dozen ballistic missiles targeted a pair of Iraqi bases that house U.S. troops, Erbil in the north and Al Assad in the west. Both President Trump and Vice President Pence had visited Al Assad in the past year. Iranian state TV described the attack as Tehran's revenge for the killing of Revolutionary Guard General Qassem Soleimani. There is no word yet on any casualties. The White House says the president has been briefed and is monitoring the situation.
A number of missiles, tens of missiles, have been launched from Iran onto an airbase in Iraq, an airbase that houses American forces. I want to bring in an expert right now, Besma Momani. We've had her on the show many times. Hi, Professor Momani. She's with the University of Waterloo. Professor, what are you hearing at this point and your initial reaction to this breaking news?
Yeah, so Ain Assad base, which is northern part of Iraq. This is probably the base where many people feel was where the missile was launched from to kill Soleimani, the IRGC general. And so we're hearing that up to the ranges from 30 to 40 missiles from Iran were directed to the Ain Assad base. This has been confirmed by the semi-official news agency, and then again verified and said by the IRGC spokespeople. And now we're getting the Americans actually confirming that, yes, there were some missiles that were hit. It sounds like initially first reports are 6. But again, it's a developing story, and we're just kind of following and seeing what's happening.
So let's set the context here, because we have been for the past few days hearing from Iran that retaliation was coming. Is this the kind of retaliation that you would say is expected?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't think that the Iranians would want to hit the Americans in the United States specifically. Their bases in Iraq make it, frankly, a lot easier to hit, just logistically speaking, and of course gets Americans upset enough and certainly makes the message clear that there's retaliation. I think the big question will be, were the American troops kind of warned to leave in advance? I mean, the IRGC and the Iranian regime don't necessarily want to have, to be honest with you, American blood on their hands, because that would just escalate things even further. But they had to avenge his death in some way to end it in terms of this tit for tat. So we'll have to see if there are reports of any death and casualty coming out of the U.S. base. This is a base that includes both Iraqi forces and American forces. So who is going to be injured in this will be, I think, the big question in terms of escalation.
What do you think about the significance of the base being in Iraq, and particularly given all of the discussion and all of the strain and tensions involving Iraq and the troops, the multiple international troops that are based in Iraq right now?
Well, one optic to me that I think is really, really quite relevant is the fact that this is the Iraqi base that Donald Trump visited. So the fact that he visited that particular base, and many people may not know this, but he kind of did it in the middle of the night with no warning to the Iraqi official government. In fact, the Iraqi government itself was quite upset with Donald Trump coming in the middle of the night and visiting this base and not even making, a state visit to the capital and talking to anybody who is Iraqi. But I think the optics of that is really very important for the Iranians. That is a way of saying, we can get you. But again, thus far, as much as it sounds escalatory, if it ends at that, we could all have, feel relieved, because in fact, what is worrisome is if they were to go further than that. So again, this is not, I think, the end of all times if it ends here. But if Americans are killed at the base, it becomes extremely worrying, because we know that Donald Trump does react to particularly U.S. soldiers and citizens being killed. He's said it several times in the past that is our red line. And so if that happens, then I think we're really going to see an escalation of targeting Iran specifically, because I don't think Donald Trump can let that one go.
Yeah, how much, I guess, right now rests on how the U.S. reacts. And again, I'll stress to our viewers that the reports are very preliminary, that we are hearing and we are reading that a number of missiles have been launched from Iran into a base, a military base in Iraq that houses American troops, where American troops are stationed. how important or how much of this rests on what the Americans do next?
I think that's a big part of it. Again, this is a tit for tat. This did not start with the killing of Soleimani. This was, a number of months of escalation. And so it's all about this kind of what we call this, level of deterrence reached where each party can feel satisfied they've done their part, but not actually going too far to cross, again, we use the word red lines a lot, but that's really what it is. Of course, for the Iranians, Soleimani is more than just a top general. I think this is what was the miscalculation of the Americans. Now, do the Iranians feel that hitting a U.S. base with no servicemen killed is enough to show the message they're displeased? And I think that would be enough for Trump to not want to react further. We might hear some, loud talk, but we won't necessarily see more of a reaction. But if American service people were killed in that base, it will be extremely difficult for Donald Trump to end it there. And then the question is what comes next? And that's what we've been, really sitting on the edge of our seats, all of us who've been watching this escalate for several months now, this tit for tat.
You mentioned sort of the reaction or the way in which this is being perceived, or particularly General Soleimani is being perceived, and perhaps sort of I think for a lot of us who have now started to read so much about him, it's surprising that that the reaction is what it has been. Why do you think in Iran particularly so many, we've seen the images, for example, of all those people storming the streets. Why do you think the reaction has been what it is?
Well, I want to first start off saying that this man has a lot of blood on his hands. Yeah. So, there's no sugarcoating the reality of what he was. He was a war criminal in my eyes and in so many people's victims' eyes. But the reality is there are hardliners who do support the regime, who do support the IRGC. And Soleimani does have this almost folk heroism about him. He's seen as this very humble person. Some of his actions, he's not that, let's say, very, boisterous type of general. He doesn't fit the image, if you will. He's very humble, very pious. And like it or not, people like that do have a lot of respect, not just, I think, in Iran, but across the region. He was very smart. I think tactfully, on tactics, I should say, and logistics, he was very bright and intelligent. And so he's not easily replaced, even though his role has been filled, if you will, but he does offer more than that. And in a time in Iran where there's a lot of corruption and the IRGC is very corrupt and certainly the regime is very corrupt, there was something of almost putting him on a pedestal that somehow he was different than the rest. Again, these are myths and mythologies, but they matter, even though, frankly, again, as I said, he may be a war criminal in our eyes and certainly has a lot of blood on his hands. But back home in certain quarters, and not all Iranians, are idolizing him. On the contrary, we just had reports of maybe up to 1,500 Iranian protesters killed by the IRGC. Many Iranians themselves have suffered at the hands of this man. But in the eyes of so many patriots, so many of those IRG supporters, he is above, frankly, even the supreme leader, even the President Rouhani. It doesn't even compare. He was the most popular figure based on very narrow kind of opinion polls that you could get in Iran, in that country, and that matters.
Okay, I want to bring in another expert. I believe he's ready to join us by Skype as well. Thomas Junot of the University of Ottawa. Is he there? Professor Junot? Okay, he's on the phone. Never mind. Sorry, Professor Rahmani. I apologize. Let's get back to, I just want to refresh for our viewers exactly what this breaking news is. There are reports that a number of missiles, tens perhaps of missiles, have been launched from Iran onto a military base in Iraq, a base where American troops are stationed. We do not know. We have no information about the potential number of casualties or if there are any at all. I think, Professor Junot, are you ready now? Do you hear me okay?
I can hear you.
Hi, Professor. Thanks for joining us. I just wanted to get your take, your reaction to this breaking news.
My first reaction is that a lot of us, and I have to say myself included, we were wrong in the sense that I did not dismiss the possibility of this happening, but I viewed it as a lower probability. A lot of us predicted that Iran's response to the assassination of Soleimani would be more indirect, more asymmetrical, would come farther down the road, would come through cyber attacks, through targeting Saudi Arabia and Israel, for example. And a lot of us were thinking thinking that something as direct and hard as what we're seeing right now was rather far less likely, because there's a serious chance of a U.S. response now, and in a scenario of escalation, which is pretty much what we're in right now. In a direct military confrontation, Iran loses against the U.S.
Does it depend? And quickly, actually, I want to bring in the White House statement. I'm just seeing on the wires a statement on these attacks. We are aware of the reports of attacks on U.S. facilities in Iraq. The president has been briefed and is monitoring the situation closely and consulting with his national security team. You can see the tweet from the press secretary right there. Professor Junot, Professor Mamani was touching on the fact that it might depend a lot on if there are casualties, and that might inform the U.S. response.
Well, if you read and listen to what President Trump has been saying, not only in the last few days, but over the last few months, he has always been very clear in talking to Iran, but in general, that his red line was American personnel in particular. So you're right to say that, whether there are American casualties or not does make a huge difference. There are reports of American casualties, but they're not confirmed, so we should be careful with that. That being said, there's an issue of American assets here. It is true that when Iran shot down an American drone in 2019, a few months ago, Trump chose not to retaliate. But in this case, the provocation is pretty strong on Iran's side. I think what we're seeing here is Iran basically playing chicken with the U.S., to use a common term, in the sense that Iran has made the assessment for 3 years now that Trump, as much as his rhetoric is blusterous, he does not want to get the U.S. bogged down in a new Middle East war. Right. So Iran is making the bet here that Trump's response will be restrained because he wants to avoid getting bogged down in another war.
CBS correspondent Natalie Brand is in Washington right now with the very latest.
Veronica, we know congressional leaders and the White House are closely monitoring this situation. We're told the president has been meeting with his national security team. House Speaker Nancy Pelosi also recently tweeted saying she's closely monitoring. She went on to say we must ensure the safety of our service members and said America and the world cannot afford war.
The U.S. Defense Department confirms Iran launched more than a dozen ballistic missiles targeting at least 2 military bases hosting American forces. The administration says it's evaluating the damage and its response. The news comes hours after President Trump defended his decision to target Iranian General Qassem Soleimani.
He was a monster, and he's no longer a monster. He's dead.
The president says Soleimani was preparing for more attacks on Americans.
He was planning a very big attack and a very bad attack for us and other people, and we stopped him.
Iran has vowed revenge for the killing, and Pentagon sources called Iranian military movements, quote, very troubling.
Our top priorities remain, first, the safety and security of American personnel and our partners, and second, our readiness to conduct operations to respond to Iranian aggression.
The U.S. military is moving more assets, including B-52 bombers.
The United States is not seeking a war with Iran, but we are prepared to finish one.
Administration officials are beginning to brief members of Congress about the president's decision to launch the strike and its repercussions.
We need to be both strong and smart, and questions of both the imminent nature of this threat, I still have questions about. The questions about, did we think through all the ramifications?
Democratic lawmakers are considering war powers resolutions to try and limit the president's ability to take military action against Iran.
Back to the latest on the airbase attack. The Defense Department in a statement tonight said it will take all necessary measures to protect and defend U.S. personnel and partners in the region. Earlier today, the Defense Secretary Mark Esper said that the U.S. is seeking a diplomatic solution, not seeking war with Iran. But he also said what happens next depends on them. And we know that military leaders have been increasing force protection in the region. On Capitol Hill, I'm Natalie Brand, KPIX.
Besma, your understanding, because we've all been waiting for that, that move that Iran would make. There were multiple options. This is one of the options Iran has taken right now. Do you think it's going to go ahead and take more action against the United States?
Again, no, I think that, this is what flurry of activity we see would end tonight from the Iranian side. The question will be what happens in terms of the response there. This is why this tit for tat is so awful and so escalatory, because there's so much calculation, but almost miscalculation that comes into this tit for tat kind of policy. So we have to wait and see, are there officials or are there U.S. service people being killed in those bases? There are reports coming through right now that perhaps Iraqi military folks in those bases have been killed. That probably will not, raise an eyebrow for Trump, unfortunately, but he will respond. If there's an American killed on those bases, I think that's when, frankly, you won't be able to hold Trump back from really wanting to attack Iran, in my humble opinion.
All right, Besma, can you throw some more light on these bases that you're speaking of? Because we do understand at least one of them is one of the largest U.S. air bases in the region in Iraq. What more do we know of how this was being used and the number of personnel that were initially present on these air bases before the repositioning really happened? Besma.
So the Americans never reveal, obviously, for security reasons, how many personnel are at each particular base or camp. That's an obvious, security parameter that they're very keen on. We know that 5,000 troops exist in Iraq. We know that there are widespread numbers. Remember here, there are no, Iraqi and American forces have been working together. So in many cases, these are not just solely American bases. They are basically cooperative bases where both the Americans and the Iraqis work together, and in some cases, NATO allies like ourselves are a part of. Certainly, one key interesting thing about Ain Assad base, which was first hit, the big one, is that this is where Donald Trump went to on Christmas Eve or Christmas last 2018. And that was a very important visit. He took a lot of, obviously, interesting photos in the middle of the night. It raised a lot of eyebrows in Iraq because he made no courtesy visit to the capital or to even tell the Iraqi officials that he was in town. But that is something that I think is quite interesting for the optics in terms of which base was hurt, which one was hit first.
All right, folks, we're going to get back to that breaking news where Iran has launched an attack on 2 U.S. air bases in Iraq.
Officials say dozens of ballistic missiles were fired at the bases occupied by both U.S. and allied forces. The White House has confirmed with NBC News that President Donald Trump won't be making a televised address tonight. All this was happening in the middle of the night in western Iraq. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and Defense Secretary Mark Esper arrived at the White House after Iran fired the rockets off. Iran has warned the U.S. and other allies against retaliating. Iran had promised retaliation for the killing of a top Iranian general ordered by President Trump.
Now, within the last 30 minutes, the FAA is now announcing the banning of all civilian flights over Iraq, Iran, and the waters of the Persian Gulf and the Gulf of Oman. And we're reaching out to Hartsfield-Jackson International Airport to see if any of those flights have been impacted as well.
Our Jeff Hullinger is standing by with more context and perspective in tonight's attack. Jeff, tell us more what you're learning right now.
All right, guys, thank you. Joining me right now is Todd Stein. He is the Majority Counsel for the U.S. Senate Homeland Security Committee. You have a resume that's like this. You're an attorney, you're an amazing life, and an analyst that we've used over the years. We're glad to have you here with us tonight. Give me your view of the events over the last week, and by that, if you would frame your view and what we should be looking at right now in terms of the killing of General Soleimani.
Well, first we have to ask what happened, right? General Soleimani was killed by the U.S. government in a covert operation while he was moving around in the wide open. Soleimani was a bad man, to say it mildly. He should be one of the most household names that Americans should know, on par with Osama bin Laden. You know, he was responsible for killing 600 troops during the U.S.-Iraq War, many more going all the way back to the '83 Beirut bombing in Lebanon. So in terms of him being a bad actor, as the United States is concerned, he was as bad as it gets. So was his death warranted? Was the president's decision to kill him warranted? Most certainly based on historical past.
Framing him by history, this is more than just a general. This is more than just a bad guy by the definition of the United States. This is a general, certainly in the form of Erwin Rommel, of Montgomery, of all of these great historical figures that we have seen that have been military men. Getting rid of him is more than just getting rid of someone that we perceive as a terrorist. This is an architect of Iran. And it's more than that. He pulls all of the levers of power in that country.
He does, but we also know from countries like Iran that they can replace themselves rather quickly. And there's a whole theory about whether or not decapitation of a terrorist group or a government works in terms of delegitimizing their purposes. So this individual was individually responsible for Americans' death, but as a part of the broader regime, killing him alone will not take down the regime. They will easily replace him. They'll easily find somebody new to do it. However, he definitely was somebody who had been in the forefront for the last 30 years and, leading the charge in terms of Iranian-sponsored terrorism.
A lot of complaints from Congress about not being notified, not being consulted in all of this. And we really have seen that issue transpire over the last 20 years. The presidents, and no matter who the president may be, they don't trust Congress, and it's reciprocal.
You could look at it as a matter of trust between the White House, executive branch, and Congress, but it's actually a lot deeper than that. We think back to 9/11. We were attacked here, arguably unprovoked. We didn't expect it. The response back from the White House was, we can take unilateral action to protect America, commander-in-chief powers in the Constitution. And so the general thinking in Washington from 9/11 onward has been that the White House can do whatever it thinks is necessary to defend the American people and then go talk to Congress afterwards. So Congress's role over the last 20 years has really dissipated when it comes to national security and foreign policy. And I think that's one of the most unnerving parts of what has happened. Yes, Soleimani perhaps deserved the death that he got. However, there's sort of the seeming feeling of lack of control about what happens next. And the American people's voice comes through Congress and their exercise of oversight over the White House. However, because of that dissipation of power from Congress to the White House on national security and foreign policy, we've sort of lost that voice, and we sort of have a unilateral action now out of the White House, and nobody's quite sure what's going to happen next. And I think that creates anxiety and uncertainty for many people who are watching this happen.
Some reporting from the New York Times over the last couple of days that the Pentagon and many of the top military people in this country were aghast at the idea that he would indeed try to kill this general. President Bush had that opportunity, but he didn't want any part of it. President Obama also had an opportunity. He wasn't going to touch it. This president opted for the extreme measure here, and there is that great concern that this decision was made perhaps in a moment of anger or just as a reflex.
It's easy to do the decision to kill, right? You have the chance to make that attack. The hardest part is always what's step 2, what's step 3, what happens next? And how do you game that out? And the truth is nobody, no expert on Iran, no expert on Iraq, no expert on the Middle East can tell you what happens next. It is purely speculative at this point. And the only thing that we can control is our response now to the attacks in Iraq to this evening. Do we escalate it even further? Do we not escalate it? But once again, there's no check on the White House on how this happens. There's also been no sort of announcement of what the broader threat is to American interests, both in the region and then also here in the homeland.
We only have seconds left. There has been the conventional wisdom among many on the right in this country that Iran is a culture, is a country that does not understand, nor are they willing to tolerate negotiation, that they understand force with force. Do you buy into that? Do you believe that Iran is a country that perhaps will understand violence more than they would understand what we view as Western diplomacy?
I think Iranian leadership would respond more to force than they do diplomacy. They will take full advantage of all the diplomacy that they can in terms of finding the weakness. Just like water, they'll find the cracks. Yeah. However, and they do respond much differently to force. But at the same time, we have to exercise our force or think about our force with some sort of broader context of what we're trying to achieve. And certainly the president has something in mind. I do think it's incumbent on the White House and the president to explain that to the American people as he pushes us further into an armed engagement like this.
Todd Stein, we're always so pleased to have you here. Thanks for coming in tonight on short notice. Your insight is of such value, understanding these complicated issues that are so vexing, for so many generations through here.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thanks, Todd.
Tonight, breaking news.
Iran retaliates, firing missiles at U.S. forces in Iraq. From the Middle East, Washington and Ottawa, the response, the stakes, and what could happen next.
Also tonight, we're on the front lines of the battle against Australian wildfires.
Overcapacity, why Ottawa hospitals have to resort to storing dead bodies in conference rooms.
And a royal thank you. Harry and Meghan's message to Canada. This is The National. We begin tonight with breaking news. Retaliation for the U.S. killing of Iranian General Qassem Soleimani has gone from fear to reality.
We know missiles rained down on at least 2 locations, bases in Iraq that host U.S. and coalition troops. So these images aired on Iranian state television. They appear to show missiles being fired into the night sky. One target, Ain Assad base in a sprawling rural area just west of Baghdad. Another, Erbil in northern Iraq, also home to a base used by coalition forces, including Canadians. So the damage and the dead, those details are unclear. We are hearing unconfirmed reports of a second wave of attacks, of Iranian jets taking off from their air bases, more targets hit. What is known is that Iran is openly claiming responsibility, which puts Washington and Tehran in a dangerous standoff. We have full coverage tonight with Susan Ormiston in Washington tracking the U.S. response, Vashi Kapelos in Ottawa on Canada's reaction and what we're hearing about those Canadian troops. But let's begin in the region. Margaret Evans is in Beirut, where this explosion of violence was dreaded and widely expected. So, Margaret, what do we know about tonight's attacks?
Adrian, Tehran has been threatening to retaliate against the United States for Qassem Soleimani's assassination, and to do so directly without relying on militia proxies like Hezbollah, for example, here in Lebanon. And tonight it seems that that is indeed what we're seeing. The grainy proof, or so it would seem, of what Iranian state television is dubbing Operation Martyr Soleimani. A series of surface-to-surface missiles hit an Iraqi base in Anbar province called Ain Assad, housing U.S. and other coalition troops. Another wave of missiles is said to have targeted the Kurdish capital of Erbil in northern Iraq, which also hosts a coalition base. Most of the Middle East has been bracing itself for just such an escalation in the wake of Qassem Soleimani's assassination last week. Tonight's missile barrage began just hours after the former Iranian general and spy master was buried in his hometown. Dozens of mourners were trampled to death when a stampede broke out in the huge crowds following the funeral procession. Also today, Iranian legislators passed a law labeling the U.S. Army and the Pentagon terrorist entities. And the country's foreign minister, Javad Zarif, repeated pledges to avenge Soleimani's death.
That's an act of war done in a cowardly terrorist operation, and Iran will take appropriate response to that.
Here in Beirut, in Hezbollah neighborhoods, giant billboards bearing Soleimani's image line the streets, a reminder of how far his reach extended and of the sectarian nature of the Middle East. The main question tonight, of course, is whether or not these strikes represent a definitive act of retaliation from Iran or just the start of it. Adrian.
All right, thanks, Margaret. Margaret Evans in Beirut tonight. Another key question is how Washington will respond. Susan Ormiston is there. So, Susan, there has to be a flurry of activity at the Situation Room at the White House right now.
The lights are on at the White House and security has been actually tightened around the building. We've seen all the national security advisors, secretaries of state and defense, and the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff go into the building. They are huddling with the president. They've been there now for several hours. The Pentagon is assessing battle damage at those two bases. We don't have a lot of details about that. But of course, the big question is, what will this president do? The president of the United States has not responded at all yet tonight. Iran seems to be indicating that after Soleimani was assassinated and this revenge attack, it should end here. It's highly unlikely, Adrian, that will happen. The U.S. has said repeatedly it would respond forcefully. It repeated that again today. Here's how the day played out.
The United States is not seeking a war with Iran, but we are prepared to finish one.
The U.S. Defense Secretary earlier today clearly preparing Americans for what was to come.
We should expect that they will retaliate in some way, shape, or form. We're prepared for any contingency.
Team Trump was on deep defense today with top leaders, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, Defense Secretary Mark Esper, and the President, all doubling down on the justification for killing Soleimani.
He's been called a monster, and he was a monster. And he's no longer a monster. He's dead.
But in death, Qassem Soleimani has remained a threat, a martyr in the eyes of his followers. In fact, tonight's operation was named Martyr Soleimani. U.S. allies, Canada included, are moving some troops out of Iraq. In a letter, Chief of Defense Staff General Vance said to ensure their safety and security. U.S. forces were already on high alert, but the government again denied today its troops would withdraw from Iraq. This retired military colonel says they should.
We are literally sitting in the desert defending ourselves like a turtle. That's the only thing we're doing. And by all rights, we should leave instead of just being targets.
Just over a year ago, President Trump made a surprise visit to the same Iraqi airbase hit tonight during the December break. He has not yet publicly responded to tonight's attack, but earlier today repeated his warning to Iran.
If Iran does anything that they shouldn't be doing, they're going to be suffering the consequences, and very strongly.
Now, Adrian, one of the red lines for President Trump is American casualties, and we have not heard whether any Americans were killed or injured. There may have been Iraqi casualties on those bases. That is unconfirmed. Also, the guards are warning regional allies of the U.S. not to allow the U.S. to use their soil to launch attacks against Iran, or they will be attacked. So it appears that the brief window since Friday of some kind of de-escalation has now closed, at least temporarily. And the question is, what will the U.S. do? And much depends on how forcefully it responds. Adrian.
All right, Susan, thank you. Susan Ormiston on top of it in Washington, D.C. So now let's look at the Canadian consequences of this dangerous escalation. Power and Politics host Vashi Capello. So Vashi, we know Canada's military leadership has also gathered tonight, but what do we know about the Canadian military personnel who are stationed in Iraq?
Yeah, Adrian, they've gathered because this is a potentially very significant event for Canada, given just how many Canadian troops are at any one time stationed in Iraq. We know there are about 500, and they're split into two separate missions. The first is the NATO mission, which Canada actually leads, and the second is the U.S.-led coalition mission to fight ISIS. And that mission is the one that everyone's particularly focusing on right now, because there are about up to 250 Canadian soldiers in the north, stationed primarily in Erbil, where we know, as we've been reporting earlier, that that is one of the sites that the attacks have been directed at. So the concern is, of course, whether or not any Canadian soldiers have been involved in that. We do know about 12 hours ago, the military announced that they were moving some military away out of Iraq into Kuwait, but we don't know what the timeline was. We don't know if that move has already taken place.
And Vashi, what about the Prime Minister? What are we hearing from him tonight?
So, as you mentioned, there is a group of senior leadership, including Chief of Defense Staff General Jonathan Vance, as well as the Minister of Defense, Harjit Sajjan. They are meeting as we speak about this. The Prime Minister has also weighed in. I reached out to his office. I got this statement back. I think we have it for you. We'll bring it up. The Prime Minister has been informed of the situation, his spokesperson tells me, and we are monitoring it closely. They said that they'll keep us posted if they have any developments. But I think the key takeaway right now is that all of the senior leadership is in a meeting. What I'm hearing from my sources in the military is they do not have confirmation one way or the other about whether or not there have been any Canadian casualties.
Okay, assessment still underway. Vashi, thanks very much. That's Vashi, obviously, in Ottawa tonight. Much more ahead on this breaking story this evening, including our panel of experts standing by.
Breaking news, President Trump just tweeted about the Iranian attacks on U.S. bases in Iraq.
That's right. He posted, "All is well. Missiles launched from Iran at 2 military bases located in Iraq. Assessment of casualties and damages taking place now. So far, so good. We have the most powerful and well-equipped military anywhere in the world by far. I will be making a statement tomorrow morning."
We're posting updates on 11alive.com, including reaction from several Georgia lawmakers. And don't forget to download the 11 Alive News app.
Good morning, good morning, good morning.
Back to our top story tonight. Iranian missile strikes on U.S. and coalition targets in Iraq. That is retaliation for the U.S. killing of Iranian General Qassem Soleimani. More than a dozen Iranian missiles launched from Iran targeted at least 2 locations in Iraq, including the Ain Assad airbase housing U.S. troops and Iraqi troops, and Erbil, where some Canadian personnel are also stationed. Tonight, U.S. officials saying there are very few, if any, casualties, but no matter what, this is an extremely dangerous escalation of tensions. between these two longtime enemies with potentially global consequences, which is why we need to talk. So joining me now are experts: Janice Stein from the Munk School of Global Affairs, Basma Momani from the University of Waterloo's Center for International Governance and Innovation, and in Detroit tonight, Saeed Khan of Wayne State University. So Basma, if we can start with you, I'm not sure people are surprised that there's been a retaliation. We've been talking about it for days, but in your estimation, what determines whether this ends or escalates right now?
So I think what we're going to see moving forward is actually de-escalation, which is fantastic news for everybody. The fact of the matter is it seems as though there was no U.S. service personnel killed on these bases, which is really important. I think that allows Trump to save face. The fact that there is no address tonight, it seemed as though also reports of Esper and Pompeo, that's the Secretary of Defense and State, who visited Trump in the White House, have now gone basically back to where they came from. And so I think things are now going to cool down. But it was a very busy night, and I think many of us were on the edge of our seats wondering if this was going to be a war.
Okay, so I think the world wants your take to be the right one. Janice, anything tonight surprise you at all?
No, I actually think the Iranians launched a very disciplined, limited, it's hard to believe that when you see the missiles flying, Adrian, but limited strike, 12 to 30 missiles on two bases, along with the most extraordinary message that came out tonight on Iranian Telegraph, which said, we're going to launch this wave and possibly one other, and that will be it if you do nothing, if you don't respond. If you do respond, Haifa and Tel Aviv will burn. I cannot remember somebody launching a strike and saying to the adversary, this will be it if you don't respond. That is a very strong message. The Iranians do not want to take this to all-out war.
The messaging was also interesting, I found, because throughout the night, Iranian state news agencies were systematically sending out messages clearly for domestic consumption.
Absolutely.
Laying claim to this. They really want this to be a win at home, clearly.
That's right. I mean, there was tremendous pressure on the Supreme Leader, and he went to the National Security Council meeting, and he said, look, there have to be two things. It has to be open. It has to be obviously from Iran, and that condition was met, and it has to be against U.S. assets. Take those two parameters, Adrian. What was done tonight was about at the lowest level that one could imagine.
Saeed, can you help us understand here, what do you think gave Iran the confidence to take this chance tonight?
Well, I think there's two things to consider here, Adrian. One is the confidence which they demonstrated with the accuracy of their missiles. These were certainly on point. The other thing that I think is important to also recognize is where was the U.S. defense system that allowed for the missiles to penetrate at least the outer perimeter and be able to strike successfully. But I think another word that we need to also consider here is perhaps compulsion. Given the very massive outpouring of public grief and anger at the assassination of Qassem Soleimani, and the fact that the Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was presiding over the services, over the funeral, weeping over the coffin, meant that the IRGC, the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Council, had to do something. Perhaps some of us were wondering whether this is a bit earlier than we thought that they would act, but they did. And as Basma and Janice so aptly pointed out, it was very, very proportionate. It was very, very disciplined. And the Iranians essentially showed what was in their sheath. In many ways, that would be seen as a rather gentlemanly way of striking back.
So, Basma, you know, I think as a Canadian, when you hear that Erbil was among the locations that was hit, you immediately think, aha, okay, we know there are Canadians at a base near there. Can you help people understand what exactly the Canadians are doing there and what changes about that mission, you know, tonight?
Yeah, so Operation Impact has 850 troops across the region. By my count, there's about 500 in Iraq. We don't know exactly where, but we do know that Erbil was one site that indeed they were visiting. And of course, I think this is a very tense time. We've seen in the past 2 days discussion and debate about where the Canadian troops are going to go. My understanding is some of them are making their way out to Kuwait at the moment. Certainly there are many allies as well. The Germans are trying to vacate to Jordan. Others are following suit. So it is not a safe time, I think, for our troops to be in the region. We knew that they were going to be in harm's way. But what this means for the operation, which was really there to help train and build the capacity of the Iraqi Federal Army, is in doubt. And that's a real shame because, in fact, the Canadians were doing a lot of good there. The Iraqi army is highly factionalized. We saw it pretty much wither into these kinds of sectarian factions back when ISIS was in town. This is not good for the Iraqi Federal Army in the long run. If Iraq is going to stand on its own 2 feet and be able to, frankly, be able to dissuade the Iranians from having their way in their country, particularly their military force and these powerful militias that have such a strong role in the military, the Canadian and the NATO forces that are there to train the Iraqi military is sorely needed, and their job is not done.
But understanding that the job is not done, but this puts some pressure on the Canadian government. Janice, what are you expecting to hear from them?
I mean, there's no question. The Chief of the Defense Staff, Jonathan Vance, talked about thinning out Canadian forces, and so I'm cautiously optimistic here, Adrian, that they're out of harm's way. But there's a larger question here. The Iranian parliament has asked that U.S. troops withdraw from Iraq. The Iraqi prime minister has supported that. Now, we're still not there. But the whole notion of having a coalition training mission in Iraq, I think, is much more politically fraught now after all this. And I think the biggest risk in all of this is not war between Iran and the United States, but it's actually civil war in Iraq. If these tensions continue to build. You know, there were Iraqi casualties tonight. That's the one thing.
They get forgotten.
They get forgotten, and that's the one thing we know.
So, Saeed, very quickly, we don't have much time left in this block, but I spoke with a State Department spokesperson yesterday who said that the fight against ISIS will continue. She was very confident of that. Are you confident this is the case?
Well, there's an irony, isn't there, that it was the Iraqi militia who were trained and coordinated by Qassem Soleimani, who were doing most of the heavy lifting on the ground in Iraq in trying to repel ISIS. So the fact that on the one hand, the United States is making statements that they are going to continue unabated in the fight against ISIS, that seems a little bit strange, particularly when we saw a rather embarrassing letter from the Pentagon, erroneously sent perhaps, that the United States is already planning its withdrawal of forces from Iraq. So we're getting mixed signals that are coming out of the White House, the Pentagon, and the State Department as to exactly what is America's future policy and its strategy when it comes to Iraq. The idea of ISIS being in place still in Iraq must be vexing for the United States. If they're planning on staying and if they're planning on having a redeployment of more troops, then the distraction of Iran and the Iraqi militia, who I'm sure they're worried about having retaliatory strikes against them, is going to be a problem if they are then looking to combat ISIS as well.
All right, everybody, we have to take a short break. So, Janice, last word to you very quickly. If I'm sitting at home right now and I'm pretty anxious hearing this news, how anxious do I need to be?
You do not. You do not need to be anxious. As I've said, we are nowhere near an all-out war. It was a real break tonight, Adrian, that Trump did not speak. That was obvious to me a big step back. I hope he doesn't speak tomorrow. If he could get through 24 hours where he doesn't speak, that would make it a really excellent day, frankly. The bigger picture here, and here's a great irony, Soleimani was actually carrying messages from Iran to Saudi Arabia. It was going through the Prime Minister of Iraq. If we see signs that back channel is going again, that will be a really strong indicator that we are through this phase. So I'm keeping my eye on that. Wouldn't that be a good thing?
All right. Thanks. Thank you all for coming in tonight.
Pressure is mounting for President Trump to give details on what prompted the strike that killed a top Iranian general.
comes as the funeral for Qassem Soleimani was held today. Thousands of mourners surrounded the coffin, leading to a stampede. 56 people were killed and 200 others were injured. Iranians continue to call for Soleimani's death to be avenged, but President Trump says the U.S. did everyone a favor by killing him.
He's been called a monster, and he was a monster.
During an Oval Office meeting with the Prime Minister of Greece, President Trump defended the decision to kill Iranian General Qassem Soleimani, saying his death was a good thing for a lot of countries.
He was planning a very big attack and a very bad attack for us and other people, and we stopped him.
Well, they're either based on misinformation or they're lying.
But Iran's foreign minister told CNN Soleimani was on a peaceful mission to contain anger in Iraq following the murder of about 25 Iraqis by U.S. forces. Defense Secretary Mark Esper balked at that, saying Soleimani has conducted terrorist acts around the world over the past 20 years and has the blood of hundreds of American soldiers on his hands.
This is no innocent man. This is a terrorist leader of a terrorist organization, and his time was due.
Iran's foreign minister reaffirmed to Iraq that Iran will retaliate for his death.
This is state terrorism. This is an act of aggression against Iran, and it amounts to an armed attack against Iran, and we will respond. But we will respond proportionately, not disproportionately, because we are committed to law. We are law-abiding people. We're not lawless like President Trump.
It's the right decision. We got it right.
Secretary of State Mike Pompeo defended the decision to kill Soleimani as entirely legal and appropriate. But a fierce political debate rages over whether there was an imminent threat of danger.
What we've heard so far from this president are tweets, threats, and tantrums. All we've heard from this administration are shifting explanations, evasive answers, repeated assertions of an imminent threat without the necessary evidence to support that conclusion.
Now, Soleimani was killed in Iraq, and the outgoing prime minister of Iraq says the U.S. has no alternative but to pull its troops out. But the president and Secretary Esper says we are not leaving. The president said it would be the worst thing to happen to Iraq.
Let's recap tonight's breaking news. Just hours ago, Iran launched ballistic missiles against 2 military bases in Iraq used by U.S. and coalition forces. Iran is retaliating against the United States for that drone attack last Friday that killed Qassem Soleimani, a top general and revered military figure in Iran. So let's take a look at those targets. The Al Assad base is located in a rural area west of Baghdad, and in northern Iraq, the city of Erbil is home to a base used by coalition forces, including Canadians. Now, a military source told CBC News there is not yet any confirmation of Canadian casualties, and officials in the U.S. say there are very few, if any, U.S. casualties. Donald Trump tweeting tonight, quote, "So far, so good." Nevertheless, the world is watching with great trepidation as the United States and Iran exchange high-powered military assaults. But check out this other battlefield where this conflict is being waged. This is what Donald Trump tweeted out after last week's deadly attack on Qassem Soleimani. Without a single word, the U.S. president signaled U.S. strength and determination. Well, tonight, this was the response from Saeed Jalili, an Iranian politician and former nuclear negotiator. Again, no words, just the flag.